First of all, thanks very much for coming to talk to me today, Barbara, about your book, Irish Women in the Great War. I'm actually going to start by just reading a little bit about you from the back cover. So, when Irish author and historian Barbara Walsh gained a doctorate in history from Lancaster University in 1999, she had already enjoyed a long and productive career which had encompassed a number of creative outlets as a writer, artist, broadcaster and multimedia producer. But Barbara, you went on to develop a particular interest in researching neglected early 20th century historical topics. And that brings me to my first question. When I was approached to interview you and I was told the name of your book, I assumed wrongly what I would be reading about. So to my shame, I imagined that a lot of the women that went to help in the Great War would have been in a nursing capacity or, support staff. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that this wasn't the case. And that's obviously how did you come across these women that went to help in the Great War? How did you start to write about this? Did you come across it through different work?
Well, it's very interesting that you had that reaction.
Yeah.
Because I grew up with people, my generation, grew up with people who served in the First World War.
Right.
So I knew, not firsthand, but since childhood, all the stories that came out of the Great War. And my female relatives were members of this, they were called WACS, for short, Women's Auxiliary Army Corps,
yeah.
With later Queen Mary's, they got posh and gave them a fancy name.
Yeah.
But, and about, I suppose it was about 2014, I saw the Centenary was coming up.
Yeah.
And just out of curiosity, I said, I wonder what has been written about the girls from Ireland. And to my horror, there was nothing. And nobody had heard of them, the museums, nobody.
Yeah.
So I started to dig around a bit,
yeah.
And I looked up the archives, and I found a certain amount. Now, they're very difficult to get to read, actually. And then I said, there's a story here. It's another of my neglected stories, unbeknownst to myself. So I started off then picking away at it to see what I could find. And since the book is out, actually, I've done some more work. And I was talking about I'd found 411, I think it was. I'm now 500.
Oh, wow.
And it's still a lot more work to be done. And I think what I'd love people to do is get the book, read about the girls, what their life was, what they did, and the whole scene, and then go digging into their own family archives to see if they can find photographs or letters or even medals.
Yeah. And who were these women, Barbara?
Well, now, who they were was, why they were formed, first of all, I think is the important thing to say, is that in 1916, the First World War was a disaster. They'd had so many campaigns, thousands upon men were killed or wounded. And they were running out of staff because they had a lot of soldiers back in bases and camps who were just doing cleaning and cooking and record keeping, which was very important. And the telecommunications, which was a very important link. This was the early days of telecommunications. There was no wireless, still experimental. So it was wire. And by Christmas, they realised they couldn't cope. And I dug into post office, the GPO archives, and I found them appealing, saying, we've got 18,000 of your men working for the army who were post office men in signal corps, because there wasn't one signal corps then, there was separate ones. And they said, could we please have some women who are technically adept to come and help to keep the communication links, because this was linking the front to the line.
They were the LOCs, were they? The line
that was
of
the LOC. So that was one fact. And then the rest of them, there were women. The army did use women, but there were civilians. And they were the voluntary aids, the VADs, which people know about. And there were nurses. There were army nurses, and there were Red Cross nurses, and there were the Women's Legion who used to run canteens and volunteer to cook. But they were all disconnected to each other. And the army said, it's all very well having these women running around, and they didn't want women at all, but they were so useful. And they said, if we got them into a proper corps, we could, dictate who they were, what they did, and where they went. And so between that and the urgent, crucial need for personnel for the telecommunications sector, they appealed to the top brass, and Earl Haig was very reluctant about the idea of women at all.
Yes.
But eventually they got permission, and they were allowed, they got some of the top brass's relatives, you know, military, from women from military families, professional women.
Yeah.
One was a doctor, and one was a lecturer. You know, they were really good.
Yeah.
But from military families to kind of head it up. And they got permission then, and from the War Office.
Yeah.
And they set up this special section of the adjutant, AG 11 it was called, under the Army Council's rule. So the last word stopped with the Army Council. And they said, we'll form this corps. And it was formed in February 29th, 1917.
Yeah. There was a bit of a set to over who was going to supervise these women, wasn't there? That was the
next
problem that they ran into.
They weren't going to give these women any army titles or ranks.
Yeah.
I mean, the head of them was called controller, but she was really, I don't know what's the top of a military, a major general or something.
Yes.
But they didn't call them that. And all the staff, what we would call officers, you know, commissioned officers, were called administrators.
Yeah.
And they were miss this and miss that, or the honourable this or that.
Yeah.
And they had to pay for their own uniforms. And they got £125 a year, which was a very big amount of money.
Yeah.
But the bulk of the people they wanted were the workers.
Yeah.
And the workers were from every class, every creed, no discrimination, and they had to be 20. But they didn't mind taking in ladies who were 30 or even 40 if they were experienced.
Yes. That was what they wanted, was
and
experience.
They wanted, but they didn't have titles. They all had the same uniform.
Yeah.
And there was no NCOs as such. You know, they were called forewomen if they were in charge.
That's right.
And workers if you were down rank. I mean, look, at that time, there was a lot of class distinction. And we've got to look at that era in the prism, not of the 21st century, but how life was lived, how society was organised.
Yeah.
So they had it all under control by 1st of March 1917. It started in London.
And it took a while to mobilise them, didn't it, to get them out to the various different... they went around Ireland as well, didn't they? There was some in Cork and some...
Yeah, they did. They got going slowly in Ireland because they had to find hostels, and then they wanted, Dublin was the headquarters.
Yeah.
And by the time they found accommodation, they were put up in Kilmainham, you know, temporarily. Yeah. And then they had a depot in Belfast. But none of this really got going until the beginning of 1918.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean to say that when I went to the records, that there weren't hundreds of girls travelling over to England, to London or Glasgow, to join up themselves.
Yes.
Because they knew this women's army and they couldn't join in Dublin.
Yeah.
So they travelled over. And the reason why they wanted to join up was so many of them had fathers. I mean, these were 20-year-old girls, most of them. They had fathers, uncles, brothers, fiancés,
sweethearts,
getting killed and wounded. And get the men back, get them home.
Yeah, yeah. And how many do you think in the end ended up on the front, do you know, or over in France for? Well, do we know?
The original idea was they weren't going to be working in England or Ireland. They were only for the front. And the first number, they've all got service numbers except for the officials, the commissioned ones. They went out early, and as soon as they were formed, some were going out a month later to France. They only wanted them for France. And here's the interesting thing. The first to go out were waitresses and cooks for the officers' mess.
All right.
In France. And there were some Irish girls went early on, and a lot of them via the Women's Legion, because they kind of absorbed a lot from the Women's Legion.
Yes.
So you can say that now, the telecommunication girls, these LFC, Lines of Communication, they were delayed slightly because Earl Haig didn't really want them, but he delayed till April, and then he eventually gave in.
Yeah, because a lot of the menfolk they needed them. There was a shortage.
See, these were highly technically trained.
Yes.
a lot of them were French speaking because they were educated. I mean, they went to French convents in England and Ireland, and they had a bit of French. And they went out in, I think it was May, the first batch went.
Yeah.
April or May, I think it was May. And they were the only ones, and they were actually seconded to the Royal Engineers. And they were kept very separate from the cooks and the cleaners and the office workers.
Yeah.
Because they were listening and hearing everything that came down the lines.
And that was a bit of an issue, actually, wasn't it? That they didn't have to swear confidentiality because they'd already, you know, as part of their work, were sworn to take the Official Secrets Act. You know, that they knew they were reliable when it came to.
I mean, to be employed by the GPO, you had to sign the Official Secrets Act.
That's it. Yeah.
And a lot of them had proven their worth by going on and manning, doing night duty in London air raids, and they got mentioned in, you know, they got rewarded by the post office for their bravery. So they'd proven their worth. Yeah. And of course, these girls were highly technically. You know, their supervisors, they could fix small repairs. You know, they knew what they were at. And
it was quite a strenuous job, wasn't it? Because you had to tap the messages.
Strenuous, yes. People don't realise now with automatic phones. Yeah. They'd sit there for their shift, and there'd be long shifts. Yeah. And they had to plug in physically on a switchboard for the telephones. At the same time, noting who they were calling and the numbers, and they'd have a dozen of them up there and watching the time on them. And for the telegraphists, they had to use a thing. I don't quite understand how I've never seen it done, but they had to thump these machines to print out the Morse code. And of course, it was Morse. They all knew Morse code. So they weren't your average girls. Yeah. And what I found very interesting is that I found 25 at least girls from Ireland, and probably a lot more of Irish parentage whose records are lost.
So when you say these records were lost, this was in the bombing in London, and the archives were bombed, weren't they? So there's very little of the records left.
Yes, that's right. In World War II, during the German bombing of London, the amount that joined the WACs, as we still call them, was between 57 and 60,000 girls, young women. Yeah. I shouldn't call them girls, really. They're young women. Ladies. But they were from 20, sometimes younger. Yeah. The parents allowed them to join, you know, at 18. And so during the bombing, all but 7,000 records were gone. So,
such a shame.
So when I'm looking through the records that I can find that are in the National Museum in Kew, it's about just over 12%. Yeah. So if I found 500 but some of those 500 are from other sources. Yes. You can. I don't know the maths, but it's certainly it's nearly 3/4 more out there whose records are no longer. But you can find traces of them elsewhere.
Wow. And what was life for these girls like over in France? They were stationed in kind of accommodation, weren't they? They were in dormitories, and you have written in the book that they actually made kind of a nice home from home. Do you know, they even had pets, I believe, and flower gardens, and you know, it was very like normal life, I suppose, for them over there, despite the danger they were in.
Yes, well, you know, they were very stalwart kind of women, and they kind of said, right, we're in this, they had to sign up for a year to begin with, and we might as well make life as easy and pleasant as possible. Yeah. Despite, and of course, by that time, by the middle of 1918, they were working across the whole of Britain, you know, and Ireland as well. All the the Curragh and places like that started to get them. Yeah. But they were in France. They were in Nissen huts, which were all sandbagged because they did get bombed, and a lot of them got killed. And in Ireland, they were in what they were called hutments. And I have a picture of a hutment in Moore Park in Fermoy, where they were. Yeah.
And the Irish girls in France, I believe they got leave, I think, was it every couple of months, but the Irish girls had to get an extra couple of days leave for the extra journey to go home.
Yeah, yes.
And the seas were quite dangerous, so even going home was a risk, you know. German U-boats and all kinds of, you know, it was nearly an adventure in itself to try and get home.
When you think of at that era, for girls of 20 or so, and most of them were around that, 20, 25, 30, you know, it was a huge adventure, because you say the Channel was full of mines, and the Irish Sea was full of submarines, and they had a long train journey between, but they got their annual leave, you know, once a year. They got 10 days or so, and they gave them a little extra.
A little extra for getting home. Wow. It must have been so strange for them coming home to like normal Ireland, you know, and trying to explain what they were witnessing over there. I'm sure they didn't get much sun when they came home.
Well, I don't know. As I say, I don't touch on the political aspects of the situation, but it was quite difficult for them. Yes. Yeah.
What I found very touching too when I was reading was when it came to the armistice then, you know, there were such celebrations that the war was over, but yet nothing really changed nearly for these girls that were still, they didn't get to come home straight away. No. Yeah.
Well, I say they wound down, but the rule was if you had a job, you could be let go.
Yeah.
But when you think of the amount of men being shipped and machinery being shipped back from France,
their job was still there.
They needed all their clerks, they needed their typists, they needed the girls in France. None of the girls came home from the exchanges, the telegraph or telephone exchanges, until October 1919. And a few stayed on into the 1920s, just a handful, you know, to mop up. So, no, it didn't stop. And they were winding down the camps here. They were letting people go. And of course, there were convalescent camps. There was places like Ballykinler and places where they stayed on before. And there was, but they were, the difficulty was life had changed. You know, it's a bit like today. They'd gone through all this. And what life had been like before the war was a totally different place to what they were facing in the 1919 and 1920.
Yeah. I thought that was particularly, they held little, in one particular chapter, they held shows, you know, little entertainment shows. And there's a paragraph at the end of that chapter where it just gives the idea that maybe they weren't looking forward to going home, you know, that they were aware, a bit like us heading out of lockdown. There's elements of it you want and elements of it you don't want, you know. So I thought that was very touching, you know, that they lived a whole different life over there, and then they weren't quite sure what they were coming back to.
Well, some of them were glad to get home because they met. Of course, there was a lot of marriages, married servicemen, but and they had family at home and lifestyle at home changed. But some of them would say, I've seen a lot of Europe. Those that stayed on, I've travelled to Europe, and I want to see the rest of the world now.
Yeah, a good few went to Canada, I think, did they?
No, you see, they offered anyone who wanted, Canada, the British government offered ex-service personnel, men and women, free or assisted passage to any of the colonies. But the colonies, oddly enough, they didn't want the clever, the telephonists, or they didn't want the office clerks or the typists. They wanted farmhands and domestic workers. So a lot of them
didn't want that either.
A lot of them went out and said, oh yes, I can do farm work, or I can do, to get out there. And then they did their stint, and then they maybe went on to America or somewhere like that. And a lot of them had married servicemen. And in Australia in particular, the Australian government offered not only free passage also, but free plots of land if they would clear the bush and set up for fruit farming or that. What I do say in the book, I have a few case studies comparing those that stayed at home and those that travelled. Yes.
Because these women were made of stern stuff, weren't they? I mean, they were in danger in France. Like, especially towards the end of the war, where, you know, there was a suggestion at one point that they moved back, you know, but then they didn't. They were very calm under pressure, weren't they?
The post office technicians were ones. There was a very interesting story in the book about it was the last push, the German push up at Saint-Omer, Saint-Omer. And it was GHQ, and it got so dangerous that everyone in the whole base moved back, all the generals and all the staff and everyone else, and the only people that were left were the girls who kept in touch, telegraph and telephone, and the head of signals there said, if it hadn't been for his 142 women, the course of the battle that was going on in Cassels, it was the name of the place, would have had a different outcome. In other words, they saved the day. Those few, and there's Irish girls based there.
Yeah, and how amazing is it then that this isn't celebrated, or that this isn't spoken about? Why would you think that is, or why? Do you know, when you started to research this as a forgotten topic, why would you think it is a forgotten topic?
Well, it's the same. I mean, nowadays things have gone much better. A lot for many years and decades. The men who fought it, Irish men, were more or less looked upon as being either disloyal, which is wrong, because a lot of them
Ireland
were
itself was in a big turmoil at the time.
People, you know, history's a funny thing. It can be written a certain way to give people an impression.
Yeah.
But when you look into the background, you know, it could be interpreted a bit differently. But certainly the men have only recently, and the nurses in the last decade have only been recognised. But because there was relatively less of these women's auxiliaries, they were, and of course the word auxiliary has kind of connotations here, it is not good, but they just were forgotten about. And now there are books about them, but I have to say they're mostly based on the memoirs of the top brass ladies, who could afford to have them published. But
and they don't
voices
give it a real
of the rank
account.
and file, if you go looking through their own files, their service files, the ones that survive, you get extraordinary stories, you know.
Well, you have extraordinary stories in this, and extraordinary pictures. There's some fabulous.
Well, some work came down to me, and the National Museum in London is very good for. But if anyone wants to look into their own backgrounds as to what. I give all the sources in the book. Yes. Absolutely. Everything very clear, where to go. And they're all digitized. You can do them online. It's very easy. But there's also these, their own, when in the post-war, they had their Old Comrades Association, and they issued a monthly gazette, and they wrote their stories. And they're digitized also. They can be gained.
Where can they be viewed?
You get them from the current army women, you know, the WRAC. But all these sources are in the book. You know, if anyone who gets the book and then gets the background, and if they want to do their own research, they can look up where I've gone. And look, I'm available. I've done more work since. I've another 100 women, and if anyone wants to, you know anything, I'll tell you. About Kildare, if you want
That's
to
what I was going to ask. Was there any?
I just think because we're talking about Kildare, the Curragh, oddly enough, there was 31. I found 31 names of women who worked in the Curragh.
Kildare or the Curragh was a very busy barracks at that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Beresford. They were housed in the Beresford. They had a hostel. What did they call them? A hostel for women. So they were billeted in the Beresford. There was, I think, something like 8 office staff that I found, and something like 5 cooks, and waitresses. Of course, the officers had their mess and their waitresses, and there were also mostly records. There was a lot of records kept apparently here, and I think looking at the records, looking at the passions. It would seem that when they came home from England or from other places in Ireland, they would be kind of shifted to the Curragh to kind of before they got discharged. Right. But the interesting thing is that I found 13 names of people born in Kildare who served, but none of them served in the Curragh.
They didn't tend to put them in their local places,
no,
sure they didn't.
There was a definite passion that wherever you were born, there was a lot of girls from Kerry.
From Kerry, that's right. Yeah, I read that.
And there was, but if you were born in the north of Ireland, you very often were sent to Cork. And Cork was the next biggest, huge amount of people.
Cork had a few problems, didn't it?
Cork had a few problems, which I won't tell you about them now, they're in the book. But Cork was the next biggest for military, for the numbers of the WAC, and Dublin was the high. And of course, photographs are very rare.
Yeah.
Very rare, and I'm still looking for them. So.
And as a matter of interest, how would the GPO have coped without its finest kind of that were, do you know, was it then stuck for staff? Do you know? Or?
Well, I tell you what they did. They were very clever. Now, don't think Ireland is any different from Scotland and England and Wales. It was all the one in those days, all the one post office, and I found that there was the big exchanges. Like, well, of course, London sent most.
I'd have a particular interest in this because my own mother worked in the telephone exchange in Naas, which is where she met my dad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, now obviously a long time later, but...
Yes. No, no, what I found was like places like Birmingham or Sheffield or Liverpool and Dublin, they were all, and Belfast and Limerick and Cork, big, busy exchanges, and they could only spare maybe 4 or 5 girls.
Yes.
And the post office was very clever because they were short of men. They were desperately short of men.
Yeah.
And the girls were taking on night duties and things because they'd lost I think about 18,000 men had, even in the middle of the war.
Yeah.
I think more went later. And how the post office coped was by letting the senior women go, but only 4 or 5 from each exchange. And they mixed them all together and sent them off to there were 3 echelons and about 7 bases and about 46 or 7 more ancillary because they had taken over the French civilian telephones, and these girls were shoved into these places to run the local.
And actually, at the start, they had to take the telephones from deserted houses and everything, didn't they? They weren't.
There was. I mean, it was all very primitive in those days. I mean, it really was. But the thing was that it was a world that was changing very rapidly, and of course, wireless was coming on, only still experimental.
Yeah.
But the front, they lost so many signal men at the front. It was a dangerous job. I mean, imagine climbing up a telephone pole in the middle at the front, in the middle of a battle. I mean,
you'd be a bit exposed.
They lost an awful lot of men. Now, the women didn't go right to the front, but they were very close.
Yeah.
And of course, they weren't armed or anything like that.
Yeah. It actually reminded me a little bit in the book of, I remember reading Birdsong years ago, and about the men who dug the trenches under the ground to try and spy. And it was a facet of the war that I hadn't known about.
Yes.
You just don't think about these kind of people.
And of course, the girls had to wear tin hats. They had, because they had air raids.
Yeah. There was one girl who got bombed, actually.
There was. And
she said, who's that lying in the wood?
In the mud, and it was herself. Got killed. This was back in 1918 when the German planes could get as far as these bases. Yeah. And they deliberately bombed. And of course, if they bombed a base, there would have been quite a few girls there. There'd be telephonists, there'd be cooks, there'd be waitresses, there'd be cleaners. Yeah. And they had a section for drivers, which was more upper class ladies who could drive cars in those days. And they drove officers, or they did dispatch riding. Yeah. And a lot of them got transferred to the RAF, the women's RAF, WRAF. But so, as I say, it was a great coming together of all the different creeds and all the different social levels, although there was a certain amount of, it was strictly disciplined. Yeah. I mean, a girl could not be seen going out with an officer. She'd be dismissed or fined or something.
Or removed of her privileges, was it? I think.
I mean, there were tales. I think one of them I tell in the book where there was this officer doing a line, as we would say, with a girl who was in. I think she was one of those signallers, and he'd put on. He'd borrow a sergeant's jacket and uniform so as he could visit her and bring her out, because she couldn't be seen with an officer. The two of them would be either fined or dismissed or something. It was very, very strict. Yeah, but it didn't do these girls in later life. Yeah, it did them. They were used. Post office girls were used to discipline. Yeah. In any case.
Yes. Yeah.
But the other girls who had come from ordinary families and that, they went back, but they were fairly acute. They'd been there, seen there, had to put up with things.
Yeah. And it's even kind of reflected in the fashions that came after the war. Do you know, things changed for women. They had a new status, I suppose, or a new, do you know, they were seen as a little bit more, I suppose, or they were capable of more, and
they
certainly owed a lot.
Yeah. They tried. I mean, there was a lot of royal rows over pay.
Oh yeah. A lot of them were left a very long time waiting for their pay.
And they were, I think the army, in a way, that's why they're not written much about. I think they had so many millions of people leaving. I'm sure the records were very difficult.
Yeah, it reminded me a bit of the vaccine rollout here. You know, people say, why is there so many mistakes? And you go, dealing with that volume of records.
Yeah, and they're all handwritten. I mean, only typewriters came in at the very end.
Yeah. But there was a lot of women waiting a long time for
a long time for their money. And there's one girl, another telephonist, of course, from Dublin, said she wrote to either Earl Haig himself to say that it was a breach of faith that she'd gone out and done her bit for 2 years out in France and suffered all the, Was that
the girl that was going to bring it up with the new Irish government?
That's right. She said she lived in North Circular Road, I think. Yeah. And she said, if I don't get a reply, I shall make contact with the head of the Irish government. She was obviously, well...
Yeah, they listened to her anyway.
I'd be very interested to know what happened to her afterwards. Yeah. But she went back to work in the GPO.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And you don't know how many of the Irish girls that went out were killed out in...
Well, no, I don't know, because someone, I believe, in London was working on how many actual WACs were killed.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I didn't go down there. I mean, there's only so much you can do.
Oh, I know.
But I mean, since the book came out, I've been doing a lot more work on finding a lot more names and a lot more interesting stories. I mean, there was one girl I found who actually ran away in London. She met a serviceman and she went missing.
Oh, God.
I mean, but they were very, the women who ran the corps, in fairness, even though they were upper class women, if they saw a bright girl, they'd promote her. And there was one wanting to be a journalist, and they allowed her to leave. I mean, this would have been after the war, after the war. Allowed her to be discharged so she could take up and go back to college. I mean, they were very keen. Yeah. Whether they were probably not exactly suffragettes, but a lot of suffragettes were in the movement.
Yeah.
But it was a movement that gave these women status.
Yes.
But as you said, the world they came back to had changed, but not always for the best for them.
Yeah.
A lot of them were expected to go back into the kitchen. And
did they go back to their ordinary jobs when they came back?
Well, if they could get one. And of course the army was very well paid by comparison to, and that's why a lot of them emigrated.
Yeah.
But it struck me how many worked in England or had families in England, and they went back to England to get work if they couldn't get it here. Because there was this one very sad story, and there again her record is lost.
Yeah.
And she was called Forewoman Flynn.
Oh, right.
And she lived near Kildare.
Ah.
And her 2 brothers and her fiancé were all killed.
Oh.
And she loved her horses. And then when she came back, she found the neighbours were so dismissive of her, of having dared join the British Army, something. She was heartbroken. So she sold up and she went to Australia.
Ah.
But I haven't found, she's one of the records that are missing. I can't, other than her name, and she lived in or near Kildare, because this was one of the stories I found somewhere else, but it's very poignant.
It must be awful to go through that, and as you say, to be so valued and so, I mean, they made a difference. They, only for them, and then to come back and for it to be disrespected or, but I suppose they came back to an Ireland that was in the middle of its own, it wasn't popular to say, I've just been off with the British Army.
And a lot of them kept their heads down. No, they did do as much good work as they could in their own association. Yeah. And they kept the friendships up. Yeah. North and South, they often travelled up to Belfast for meetings, and Belfast had travelled down for meetings. They had their own, and they'd have friends over from England whom they'd met in France or in England even, So many of them worked in England. But I was quite, I mean, there was... to actually pin down what happened, a lot of them would be a very, very interesting study.
Yeah, might be something somebody will decide to do.
I don't know, but I've done a lot of work. Maybe I might be tempted, but
I think so. I think so. I just, as a fiction writer, there was just so many stories that I thought that would make a brilliant film. That would make a brilliant film. That, there's just so much to it.
And the thing that it's never mentioned. Well, if you ask anybody, I mean, if you mention it, like you, to say, did you know there was army women up in the corps? They'd say, what? Who?
Yeah.
No.
I genuinely
never
didn't.
know. I've had it said to me, never any women in the corps. Oh. And of course, there they were.
Yeah, and would they have been the only women in the Curragh at the time? They would have.
Well, no, there would have been. Well, I'll tell you, one of the girls that I came across was born on the Curragh. She was a farmer's daughter, Annie Kelly, and they had to give references, and her reference was the Alexandra nurse who was attached to the Curragh. So there would be nurses in the Curragh, and this nurse wrote, yes, she'd be very suitable as a waitress. Yeah. She was working, now just to give you an idea of what life was like for them, she was working in Kellett's, which was a drapery store in George's Street. I remember it, a big drapery shop in Dublin. But she was not being paid any wages because she was being trained.
Oh.
So, I mean, a job as a waitress in the army would get her maybe £1 a week. And to them, that was a lot of money.
Not to be sneezed at,
So she joined up, and she served not in the Curragh or anywhere there, she served in Dublin. And another girl from the Curragh, from nearby, is actually just down the road from where I live, at Cross Keys. Her father, she was born in Nerney. Her name was Ryan, Mary Ryan, and these girls were 20 or so. And this girl, Mary's father, was a groom in the National Stud. Oh. And she volunteered and became a waitress. Yeah. And she was sent down to Templemore. Ah. And she served there, and she served in one other place, and she did her year. Yeah. But they never were sent local, as you say. They were sent because they didn't want cliques. Yes. Yeah. And that was the whole. If you look at the batches that go out, you'll have a girl from Liverpool, a girl from Leeds, a girl from Limerick, a girl from Belfast, and they all had to hump in together and understand each other. And it was actually very good for their later in life. It was a leveler. They were able to get on with everybody. Yeah. Yeah. And they tolerated each other's whims and foibles, and it was a shattering change, really. Yeah. And as you say, if somebody, I would heartily recommend somebody get hold of your book if they have an interest in any of this kind of thing. But if somebody has a suspicion that maybe somebody in their family did serve in the Great War, or where would they start? Well, they start with the book. Start with the book. I suggest. Then they get the picture. Yeah. And a lot of your and they can look if they want to look up any of the sources for themselves. But I'm open to, if anyone wants to contact me to the library here, there could be a deluge. I'd be more than happy. I mean, I won't do the work for them, but I'll point them in the right direction. Yeah. And maybe if they're from a county, I could give them the names of the girls from that county, and I have an alphabetical list. So if someone rang me or emailed me to say, my granny was called Byrne and she lived in Newbridge, I'd look up and say, I don't have any Byrnes in Newbridge. Or I'd say, there was a Lottie Byrne and there was a Jessie Byrne. Would be either of those. So you never know, it's a chance. And come here, what's next for Barbara Walsh? What other forgotten topics would you like to look at? I don't know. Yeah. Well, I've a lot of work still. I've only scratched the surface of this topic. Yeah. So I'm sticking to the statistics now, and I'm nearly there. And I'm hoping to contact. I mean, normally I'd be going around giving lectures to history societies and getting them interested. So I'm having to do it virtually. Is that what you call it these days? But isn't it great that we can do that? Do you know? But I think people who get the book, they'll have enough meat in it to follow their own little adventure. Oh, it's absolutely fascinating. And it's a lovely read. It's not, you're never bogged down with facts. Like I really enjoyed reading now, as you can see. Well, you see, the reason I wanted it used by academics, but if I wrote it, I have written for academic university stuff, and I've given lectures to engineers and things about technology, but I deliberately kept it non-academic speak, if you like, but gave the academics all the statistics and footnotes and sources that they could follow up on without spoiling the prose. Yes. So that people could just sit down and just as a good read. Barbara, we're going to finish up, but I just want to talk a little bit about the book itself, which is available from www.penandsword.co.uk. How long did it take you to write this book? Well, I started thinking about the anniversary would come up in 2018, and so I started picking at the idea in 2014. And I went looking to see what was written, because I knew about the Barracks, but I'd never read anything about them. And when I read them, I found that, like as I said, there were all the memoirs of the top brass and nothing about Ireland. And when I went looking, but there must be somebody's written it about Irish, and nobody had. And I spent about a year with a London publisher who wanted it for gender studies or something, I don't know. It wasn't what I wanted. So I went back and I started to research the Irish element. So it was 14, 15, I mean, each book I do takes about 4 or 5 years anyway.
You have another fascinating one about Woolworths, I believe, which I'm going to get next.
Each book would, if you want to research it properly, you need that, you know. Yes.
And absolutely fascinating. I would highly recommend it for anyone who's so. Irish Servicewomen and the Great War by Barbara Walsh, and it's available from penandsword.co.uk or from any good bookshop, including Farrell and Nephew across the road or Barker and Jones in Naas.